Hello and welcome back to our discussion of informal fallacies. In this video, we are going to be turning our attention now to unacceptable premises, fallacies that focus on premises that are unable to provide truth for the conclusion, provide support for the conclusion. So the first fallacy that we're going to consider is called begging the question. So let's take a look at this one. This fallacy is one that involves unacceptable premises because one of the premises is actually the conclusion, right? One of the premises that's being used in the argument is the conclusion that's being argued for. And that's a problem, right? This means that you're assuming that the conclusion is true from the very beginning, from the very start. You cannot simply use the conclusion as one of your premises. That means that you're assuming that the person that disagrees with you is wrong, and you're just asserting yourself as being correct or whatever you believe is true. But before we move any further into this fallacy and discussing it, I want to call to your attention what the fallacy is not. Oftentimes, you might hear people say things like, that begs the question. In fact, I hear this all the time on the news or on different podcasts, and you may have heard this as well. And typically, what people mean when they say this begs the question is they mean something like this raises a new question or this raises a new issue. But that's not exactly what philosophers mean. Now, in philosophy, when we're doing logic, begging the question means something very specific. So I want to pay close attention to this. What we mean is that we're assuming the conclusion is true. We're assuming the conclusion as one of our premises and that our opponent's view is false. So I'm raising this point so that we're careful and we're not using this term begging the question to mean raising a new question or raising a new issue. We want to make sure that what we're referring to, what we mean here, is the fallacy of assuming the conclusion is true as one of our premises rather than giving support for the truth of the conclusion. So now let's think about a very common example, an example that is oftentimes used. In fact, in the textbook, it's used on page 293 to help illustrate this point. Imagine that somebody wants to try to show or argue for the claim that God exists. And so they say, well, we know that God must exist because the Bible says so, and we should believe what the Bible says, well, because God wrote the Bible. This is actually a fallacy of begging the question. If we begin by saying that the Bible says God exists, and the Bible must be true because God wrote it, therefore God exists, well, we're using the conclusion as one of our premises. It's basically like just saying P, therefore P. And that's a problem. We can't just automatically assume the conclusion that we're trying to argue for. It's like reasoning in a circle, right? That, in fact, that's another way that we can put this. This fallacy is a kind of a fallacy of circularity, reasoning in a circle. And notice the fallacy can occur when we're using a premise that's not directly stated, right? We could use an implicit premise, something that's hidden but not directly stated. In fact, that happens all the time. And so we need to be careful. We need to try to really evaluate what's being argued for in the argument. It might be the case that somebody is assuming the conclusion is true as an implicit or tacit premise that's not directly stated in the argument. That does happen. So we just need to pay attention and look to see whether it's occurring or not. Now, I said that this fallacy involves arguing in a circle or reasoning in a circle. And sometimes the fallacy is just literally called a fallacy of circularity. So let's see what I mean here in a little more detail. It occurs again when the conclusion that you're trying to prove is used as one of the premises in the argument. Consider the following two arguments. The first argument says, God exists, therefore God exists. And the second argument says, God does not exist, therefore God does not exist. So notice what's going on in these two arguments. First of all, technically speaking, both of the arguments are valid. And that's because of our definition of validity. We'll see this definition and pay attention to it in more detail next week. But the basic idea is that if the premises are true, then the conclusion necessarily must also be true. So it meets our definition of validity because the premise and the conclusion literally are the same thing. So if the premise is true, then technically speaking, the conclusion must also be true. And that applies in both cases. So both of these arguments, technically speaking, are valid. That doesn't mean they're good arguments. Just because we're saying they're valid doesn't necessarily mean they're good. But notice also that one of the arguments must be sound. And of course, we don't know which of the arguments are sound, but that doesn't matter. We know one of them has to be sound because of our definition of what soundness is. Again, we'll say much more about this in the following modules, but for now, soundness just means that the argument is valid and everything stated in the argument is in fact true. All of the statements are true, right? So that does apply for at least one of these two arguments. We don't know which one it is. And so it's hard for us to figure that out because we don't know whether God exists or not. But technically speaking, both arguments are valid and at least one of them is sound. Why should we reject this argument? Clearly, we should reject both arguments. So then why should we reject either one of these arguments, given that we know one of them is sound? Well, the reason why we should reject both is because they are circular, right? We're using the conclusion as one of the premises. So we're assuming from the very beginning, at the very get-go, we're assuming what we're trying to prove. And that means that we're reasoning in a circle, which is uninformative. And another way that we can put this is that the argument is trivially true. The argument isn't telling us anything interesting or anything informative. When we say P, therefore P, we're just reasserting what we've already said. We're being redundant. It's trivially true that P, therefore P. So what's wrong with a premise or an argument that's trivially true? Technically speaking, it's not because it's false. In this particular case, we don't know whether P is false or true. But it's the fact that it cannot provide support for the truth of the conclusion because you're just literally reasserting the conclusion. You're being redundant. It's trivially true. It's uninformative. So that's what I'm saying. That's what I mean here when I say that that it's trivially true. It's just simply uninformative. It's like saying it is what it is. It's not helpful at all. It's we say this all the time. I hear people. I even say this all the time, but it's just not very helpful. It's sort of redundant. Consider the following examples. I think these will help clear up what I'm talking about here when I say that it's trivially true. Imagine that somebody says, well, everybody loves Rebecca because she's so popular. Well, that's not very informative. That's not very helpful. You're just sort of repeating yourself. Or if somebody says you must obey the law because it's illegal to break the law, that's just saying the same thing twice. It's being redundant. Or if you say Harold's new book is well written because Harold is a wonderful writer, that's just two different ways of saying the same thing. Or if somebody says America is the best place to live because it's better than any other place to live or any other country. Again, that's just, uninformative. You're repeating yourself. Or if somebody says violent video games causes teens to be violent because violent teens play violent video games. Again, this is trivially true. You're just reasserting yourself. You're not saying anything new. Or consider an example that Donald Trump has actually said quite a few times. The news is fake because so much of the news is fake. I mean, come on, it doesn't get much more obvious than that. So these are all examples of what you might call just trivially true statements that are uninformative, unhelpful, and they're not telling us anything new. And that's essentially what's going on in the begging the question fallacy. It's a circularity problem. You're just reasoning in a circle, and that means that the premise is unable to provide support for the truth of the conclusion, and that means that it's a fallacy of unacceptable premises. Now, of course, this is a fallacy that's all over the place. This happens all the time. And so I want you to be careful and pay attention to different things and see whether or not these sort of claims are being made, whether people are reasoning or maybe whether or not you are reasoning in a circle. Now, in the next video, we will turn our attention more specifically to the fallacy of the false dilemma, or sometimes it's described as a false dichotomy, as well as the decision point fallacy, which is very similar. So that's what we will look at next.